Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist. This is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, relationships. I am absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Marlene Winell with us today. She is a licensed psychologist, and she coined the term religious trauma syndrome, which I'm going to be totally honest, Marlene, back in the day, 20 plus years ago, when I heard this term, I kind of rolled my eyes like I do sometimes when people come up with new terms. And ever since then, I've been not rolling my eyes. I have been working with tons of people from high demand and conservative religions. I mostly work with people who come from the Mormon LDS faith, people who come from evangelical backgrounds, Catholic backgrounds. This is really, really hard stuff, really difficult stuff when people are wrestling with their love for their faith, their traditions, their families, and yet are not finding their religious practice healing or actually, exacerbating symptoms like anxiety. And many, of course, are leaving organized religion, as we know through the polls today. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today. Let's get started with just kind of you introducing yourself a little bit better than I just did and telling us a little bit about your background. I'd love to hear kind of how this came to be in your life.
Okay, thank you. And I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to learn more about leaving Mormonism as you have experienced. So I'm always learning about this, and I should explain that I wrote this book, Leaving the Fold, in 1994. I was almost forgetting the date, but a long time ago, right?
Yes.
And I wrote it at a time when there really wasn't any attention to religious trauma, and I was trying to just spell out what I thought some of the issues were and what some of the steps to recovery might be. And it was a huge learning experience for me and helpful in my own spiritual growth. And then I received referrals, and my work grew after that because there was a need for attention to this subject, it turned out. And then, as you mentioned, years later, it was in 2011, I had come to the conclusion that the problem of religious trauma and religious damage was bigger and deeper than I ever realized, even in writing the book. Okay. And over the years, I had a lot of clients. I also just talked to people and decided that something needed to be named, just like we've had names for things in other areas, like with, for example, eating disorders. Somebody named anorexia, and then people understood that it wasn't their own fault. They felt less alone. There became research and treatment methods developed and training. And so having a name for something is hugely helpful. And so I thought we needed a name for this. And I called it religious trauma syndrome after running a few ideas by some colleagues, what should we call this? And that was the one that we came up with. And the reason it's religious trauma syndrome is because a syndrome is defined as a collection of symptoms that are shared by a particular identifiable population. Okay, that's what syndrome means. That's all it means. In fact, trauma just means injury, Anyway, so decided on calling it religious trauma syndrome because there is a pattern. There are typical symptoms. There are typical issues that people coming out of religion have. And I was also noticing that we can think about it in comparison to other kinds of trauma and in comparison to PTSD or cPTSD. The one, cPTSD, would refer to the trauma, the injury from being in a restrictive authoritarian religion in the first place, what that can do to an individual. And then the PTSD usually refers to an event. It doesn't have to be all at once, but it refers more to an event instead of a continuous series of abuses, like cPTSD, which is like domestic violence or child abuse or something like that. But PTSD is an event. And so in the case of RTS, what we're talking about is the experience of leaving your faith. Okay, which is a traumatic event in itself, because your whole life gets turned upside down. It's like your reality gets ripped out from under you. What you thought was real, what you thought about yourself, your identity, your world gets completely changed. And so you feel like an immigrant or somebody that's moving from one world to another. So that's the event part of it. And so I ended up with this idea of this two-part kind of trauma, which I've called religious trauma syndrome. So that's a big first reply to your question.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And that totally fits exactly what I'm seeing on my end. We just read Leaving the Fold as part of a membership group support system that I run for people who are leaving high demand religions, and everybody just really loved it. Very, very applicable, very, very relatable. So, and yeah, when you wrote that book in 1994, so I started my MFT program in 1995. So you can see that I was starting to be aware of you a long time ago. So this is, exciting. How much are you willing to just share a little bit about your own personal background? You do a little bit in Leaving the Fold, just you come from religion yourself. Do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of how this hits on a personal note as well?
Well, I'm the child of missionaries. And so I was born in Hong Kong and grew up in Taiwan, where my parents were Assemblies of God missionaries. And I was there until I was 16, moving to Southern California at that point. But while I was in Taiwan, I went to a Christian boarding school, and I also became very serious about my faith. I basically became a Jesus freak, you might say. And then when we moved to Southern California, it was 1968. It was the summer of love. The Christians had, there was a new church called Calvary Chapel, which was kind of the Christian response to the hippie movement. You know, we all went to church barefoot, and we had a little Christian commune, and we had a good time being high on Jesus instead of high on drugs. We had all of our alternatives, and baptized people at the beach, and Christian rock and roll was getting off the ground. So it was a very exciting time, but also very serious for me, in that we believed Jesus was coming back any day, you know, and we also believed in heaven and hell. We believed all of these hardcore beliefs in fundamentalist Christianity were real, even though we were singing and dancing about it. It was still a very real type of thing. So I was very involved, very serious about that. But I also was a smart kid, and I did a lot of reading and studying, and even writing papers about belief systems and so forth. I was a little bit of an anomaly in my high school. But anyway, I went to college. I went to a liberal secular college. I went to the University of California at Irvine. And then over the years, just really evolved, really changed in my whole worldview. And both intellectually and emotionally, everything changed as I got more information, and also as I got disenchanted with things that were in the religion. I found out more about the origins of the Bible, no longer believed it was the word of God, met people that were not Christian that were also happy and healthy, and realized that the Christians did not have a corner on all of that. We did not have a corner on meaning in life or joy or any of those things we claimed. So my world got much bigger. And I also embraced feminism. So I got pretty tired of the patriarchy. You know, all these changes happened with me developing as a person, coming out of adolescence, and getting a lot more information.
Right. And what kind of cost do you think that was to you? Was that difficult for you in regards to family and things like that? Or were your parents more, I guess, able to accept these changes in your life?
the cost was a real disruption to my community because I had been involved in the church. And that's the thing, you know, sometimes churches can provide things that are totally fine, they're totally healthy, like community. Okay. It's a place to go, it's a place to share values with other people. And I was very involved in the youth group, and we did all kinds of things. We did Christian things, you know, like witnessing at the beach and so forth, but we also just had fun together. And these were people that shared, and we had this sense of being special, and we were the ones that knew the truth, and all of that was very, very important and special. So I basically lost that because I couldn't identify with the belief system anymore. My parents, they had already always encouraged education. You know, they had encouraged me to get good grades in school and read and be educated. So I think that kind of boomeranged a little bit, in that my education really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And they had some trouble coping with it. They didn't force me to come back to church, but they also had to cope and adjust to that. And when my book came out, finally, that was a little hard for them, even though I didn't criticize them directly so much as the system. But yeah, it was a big adjustment to my whole social. At the same time, I had a boyfriend and got married, and this was a young man that I had met, and then I basically brought to the Lord, as they say, converted him, got him baptized at the beach, and so we had this Christian wedding overlooking the ocean, and it was all very, very sweet. But then later we both together left the faith, so that was fortunate. But I'm mentioning the wedding because in my faith, I had this personal relationship with Jesus, right? Where I'm relating to him as if he's a real person. And I've called him my first lover. You know, you have this incredible imaginary friend, but more than just a friend. And so you feel loved all the time. You have somebody to talk to all the time. But yet to fall in love with a real human being is a different matter. You know, you can have physical contact. You can have real hugs instead of imaginary hugs with God. And sex, you know, sex is a pretty fulfilling thing and a pretty big discovery. So my relationship with him, I think, also helped break me of an addiction to God.
That's really, really an interesting comment, that idea that we're having an imaginary relationship, right, with somebody who isn't tangible. So that's really interesting. So we live in a nation that is, or has been historically, you know, primarily Christian. You know, I remember, especially when you were writing this book, like the numbers would come back that like 80 to 90% of Americans would, you know, identify as religious or Christian. That has lessened quite a bit, at least from an organized religion perspective. Now the numbers are really coming back at 50 to 60, I believe, are the latest Pew polls. A lot of people still consider themselves spiritual, but I'm just wondering what kind of pushback you received as you were writing these things. Were people upset? I know even in the research, whenever I try to research, like, what are the effects of religious trauma? How is religion harmful? You really find a lot more on how religion is helpful, and you know that people in religions are doing really great. And I do think, like you mentioned, there's a community factor there that is very protective for people. But I don't know that we've been as willing to talk about the harmful parts. And then, of course, this research is self-report. So I know that when I was more active and believing in my church, I would have reported I was doing great in the church, you know, only kind of with some deeper perspective that I'm like, oh, actually, I was buying into some ideas that were not so healthy for me. So anyway, that's a long question, but just kind of what pushback and what do you think about the research and all of that stuff? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there are layers to this. There's the personal, the community, and then there's this national kind of religiosity. And I've written about that. I wrote an article called "It's Not Just Personal Anymore," and the cultural collective trauma that we have from religion. And the truth is that religion in our country, I'll just talk about our country for now because that's what we're dealing with, has been traditionally a religious nation. And we revere all kinds of religious things. We say, in God we trust, and things like that. And we have prayer at our inaugurations. We swear into the Bible and on the Bible in court and so forth. So there's this general idea that religion is either good for you or at least benign. Okay. And so what that does, it prevents, I think, a very clear look at what the effects of religion really are, like in the research that you're talking about, or in psychology programs in college. I mean, nobody ever really looks at what the damage might be, because it's just totally obscured by this cultural idea, which is very, very strong. And regarding that research, yeah, there are methodological problems with all of that research. And the one is the self-report idea. You know, when people are asked if they're happy, if they're satisfied with something, there is this natural, call it defensiveness, but a natural inclination to say, I'm fine, I'm good, and to feel some loyalty to the system that you're in. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that the religion is mixed. It is mixed. It's providing you with community. It's providing you with assurances about the afterlife. It's providing you with the idea that God is taking care of you, that God is comforting you. And, you know, your brain receives these ideas and works with these things emotionally and mentally as if they're true, even when they're not. Okay? So you have an imaginary friend that is ruling the universe and looking out for you and has a plan for everything. And you have a part in that plan. I mean, how special can you get?
Yeah.
And so, and you're in this social environment that it reinforces it again and again. I mean, other people are also believing this, and that social support is hugely powerful. And also, it starts in infancy. It starts with childhood. These fantastical ideas, you know, about how the world was created, and the idea of God at all, and miracles and stories in the Bible, and the Bible being the word of God. These are all ideas that are taught to you as a small child. At the time when number one, you're not getting any alternatives. You're not being offered a choice of religions or secular views. You're not offered humanism as an alternative as a 5-year-old. You're given things that are supposed to be true and are shared by your family, which you're totally dependent on for survival. And then there's this incredible support. You know, you're being taken to church at least once a week, usually more. And as Mormons, you end up going to seminary, right? So it gets reinforced. And it starts at a time when your cognitive abilities are not mature enough to deal with it. You do not have the mental ability to question.
Right.
You're not processing. And anybody that studies child development will know that a 5-year-old basically has a magical way of thinking. They will believe, they'll believe in Jesus, sure. And that sounds all very nice. They will also believe in Santa Claus and believe in the tooth fairy. Mm-hmm. It's all in the same world.
Yeah.
And so this kind of indoctrination goes so deep, and it becomes subconscious. You're not even thinking about it.
Right.
So and the other thing, I read an article about, you know, the benefits of religion, and how people that are religious are more satisfied and happy than others, and that people leaving religion are very unhappy. But it was a cross-sectional study, okay? And I have a degree in human development where we emphasize longitudinal study, what happens over time. Mm-hmm. So it just, you know, kind of pissed me off that these people were doing this study that were, you know, they were interviewing people that had recently left their religion. And I'm saying, well, of course they're having trouble. They're going to suffer anxiety and depression and fear about their life, that not having God's plan anymore. They're going to go through trauma as they go through this transition, because it is such a huge transition and it's scary. So of course they're having a hard time. And then there's no follow-up. There's no study of how they're doing 5 years later or 10 years later, when people will then report that they've survived the trauma, that they feel liberated, that they're growing personally in so many ways, and they're so glad they've left their religion behind. they don't get all that data because they were asking these questions at the wrong time. And then all the data, like I said, when you ask people that are still in the religion, they are still pretty much locked into their indoctrination. So the self-report is pretty suspicious.
Right.
Anyway, there's a long way to go in terms of research. And I would say most of that research on the benefits of religion is highly flawed in its methodology. It doesn't separate out the factors.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that both in my evangelical communities and in my Mormon communities, there's a big emphasis on this idea that if you're saved and if you've got God in your life, you kind of have to be happy. There, you know,
Yeah.
you have to be. I mean, and that's kind of the
Yeah.
pressure to present as happy, and even
Uh-huh.
almost kind of like this missionary moment, right? Where I've got to like convert others because I've got to show them how happy and wonderful it is to be in our
Yeah.
flock, right? So there's that kind of internalized pressure too to kind of present in a certain way. And anyway, so yes, I agree with all that. So you called you used a very interesting term, right? Which is you were addicted to God. And you're talking about how, you know, maybe some of these things can be psychologically harmful, which I do think from everything you've said, it might be difficult for people to be like, wait, Christianity is psychologically harmful, you know, like this is such a blessing or this is such a wonderful thing. So can you start maybe addressing some of the bullet points, which I know it's impossible to cover all of them, but why might we be concerned about psychological harm as therapists and professionals in the field?
Yeah, well, I think we can agree that there are all these symptoms, like I was talking about with leaving, especially with leaving. But I have come to the conclusion that with all the fundamentalist versions of the major religions, there are two really big assumptions that are taught to you that can be very deep and become subconscious. One is you're not okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're born in sin. You're born with human nature is supposed to be bad. You're going to be doing bad things, and you need to be sorry and grateful for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you are saved, there's still this feeling of not being good enough.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is you're not safe. You have to be afraid of what's going to happen to you after you die. That's the ultimate fear.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might go to hell if you don't play it right. But also afraid of the world, afraid of other people, afraid of sinning. You can't even trust yourself. You're afraid of yourself and afraid of God. So that can be really lasting too. People coming out of that faith can still have anxieties about all kinds of things and not feel safe in the world, not feel safe with life. So you're not okay and you're not safe are, I think, the two very broad areas of damage, and those areas of damage can be very deep, to where even when you do not believe it anymore intellectually, it's still very difficult to change those deep assumptions.
Yeah, that's really profound, because before you've even done anything, you're deemed as unworthy or sinful. As natural man is an enemy to God type of, idea is very difficult, because then there's really no way to trust yourself. And, every emotion you have, every feeling you have, every desire you have, it's kind of like you've got to put it through this litmus test to see, well, is this something God would want me to do? Is this something that is okay? Is it something I just want, or is it something that God wants for me? Or is it Satan that's tempting me? Right. So I always talk about, we're kind of brought up with two voyeurs. It's like you've got God, who's constantly watching you and can even be inside your head and know everything about you. And then you've got Satan, who is also, kind of mulling around, trying to get in your head and watching you too, and to no privacy, no sense of boundaries.
No privacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. No privacy.
Yeah.
And that can get, depending on personality differences, that can get very, very invasive. It can cause a lot of anxiety and even physical symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's your thoughts as to why people tend to generally leave religion? What kind of breaks the point of, oh, I'm finding this a useful, loving community, to this isn't working for me anymore?
Well, I think that changes can happen intellectually and also emotionally. You can simply have exposure to more information like I did, and learn more about things. And with the internet, that's actually significant because you can look up the data, you can look up the research and evidence on anything you want. And so I know that with Mormonism, people have been able to read up on history and read up on the sacred, the various scriptures, like the Book of Abraham, and find out whether or not that's a document that should be trusted or not. And the history of Native Americans and whatnot. So there's a lot of information that's much more easily available. And some people would rather believe the truth than just be comforted. That's not everybody. Some people just shut their eyes. They don't want any more information because they want to emotionally feel okay. And you're also told not to say read anti-Mormon. That's called anti-Mormon literature, right?
Right.
And you're not supposed to read it. And so there are ways that people insulate themselves from information because they don't want to be bothered. But there are many people who want the truth, and the truth becomes more important than just being comforted. And so when that happens, then you have this breaking out intellectually, and then you have to figure out what to do about that. Other cases, it's more emotional, or just you have some transitions that might even be cultural, like discovering feminism, like I did, and really starting to see problems with the system of the religion. All these systems are very hierarchical and usually patriarchal, right? And so there can be an emotional reaction to that. Also, emotional reactions to the way that things are being operated in church. Usually there's a lot of power structure and power issues that you can have a problem with, or just being let down by leaders in churches that are not who they claim to be. I mean, this happens in cults, where there's like a significant leader that's supposed to be perfect in every way, and then you find out all sorts of stuff and scandals. And so you can get disenchanted with the religion, the people, and be very sad, very, very hurt about it. This is a big loss. We're not just talking anxiety and depression. We're also talking grief, of losing something that was really important to you. But if it feels wrong, it's, you're reading the Bible now and you're realizing, hey, God authorized a lot of genocide. God in the Bible does this and this and this, and that, offends me and my personal values. And you start to realize that your own ability to form your own values and think about what you think is right and wrong ends up being valid and more important than you realized. And there's this conflict. People sometimes go through a lot of cognitive dissonance. There's a period of time where it's hard to let go because it was important to you. Like letting go of my relationship to Jesus was hard. And for a couple of years, I was like defending the Bible and defending Christianity, saying, oh, well, that was a cultural thing back then. They treated women like that because it was the culture, and excusing things so that I could hang on to the emotional part that was so important. But then after a while, you just get tired of doing that. You get tired of twisting yourself into pretzels, trying to make it all work and fit, right? And then you meet people that are outside the faith and finding out that, hey, they actually do have alternative worldviews. There are other ways, even though I was taught that there's no other way to think that's coherent or true or makes any sense or isn't evil. You find out, no, there are other worldviews. There are a number of them. And you find out more about how people outside the faith actually manage to organize their belief systems in a way that doesn't include religion. And they're actually doing okay with that. So, finding out about humanism, for example, is a very coherent way of thinking about life that just doesn't have any room for the supernatural. So to have natural explanations for things and appreciating science as something that can explain things like demon possession. Somebody's having an epileptic fit, they're not demon possessed, and that this extends to all sorts of things. So, that's a long answer to your question, but I think that people break away emotionally and intellectually sometimes at the same time. and just have a more desire to have some personal integrity. That's what it comes down to at some point, is that you want to have your own integrity about what you think and how you're running your life, and you're not compromising on that. And for that reason, you feel a real strong need to reject things that just don't feel true anymore.
Yeah. And the sense of betrayal that goes along with that grief you were talking about, especially when there are leaders that let you down, or when you feel like you've been told a certain narrative your whole life, or money scandals. We're having one of those in the LDS church right now, as far as, how tithes are used, all this. So you had this idea of how things were going and what they meant. And then all of a sudden it's like, Wizard of Oz, you draw back the curtain and you're feeling a huge sense of betrayal that is not only attached to your beliefs, but is attached to your life decisions, right? So how many people have made very significant life decisions based on these beliefs, like who I might marry, or how many children I'm going to choose to have, or whether or not I'm going to follow a certain career, because, especially like in a lot of patriarchal religions, there's this pressure for women to stay at home with children or to not really become very educated. Those can be really, really painful things when you're 40, 50 years old, and you can see the limitations now of your life going forward due to religious decisions that really had an impact on your quality of life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and having been through the Mormon experience yourself and worked with ex-Mormons, I was curious what you think about what I've said in terms of how it applies to ex-Mormons, and what you think the biggest challenges are for Mormons to leave the faith.
Yeah, I think everything you've said absolutely applies. There's not one thing I would say does not apply. I think the biggest challenges, and I think this is true of most high demand religions, is that you are, one, not taught to trust yourself, right? So any idea that you have is now seen suspect if it goes against the conformity of the group, and you're seen as either being deceived or being a bad influence, right? And so people start ostracizing you or start treating you differently, and so you are really delving into huge societal ostracization. We don't do shunning, like the Amish do. Like there's no formal necessarily shunning, but people feel shunned. People feel like they're going from being a person of worth, a person of respect, a person in the community who is seen as awesome and great and good. And now all of a sudden being seen as kind of like an evil influence that people want to stay away from, or I don't want my kids playing with your kids, or I don't want my son dating your daughter, right? Or because you now represent something very different. That is extremely difficult, especially with the research that we have around social safety and how important that is to the human experience.
Right.
So I think that's really hard. And I think along with that, people, are dealing with a lot of what you're talking about, grief and anger and betrayal, and that whole grief process. Well, that, like you're saying, that ups the symptoms of anxiety and depression and hopelessness. And maybe now I'm dealing with an existential crisis, right? What does happen to me? I really did like this idea that I might see my family after I die, or that I could, be with God, and that I would continue to exist after this, mortality. So that can be really hard. And then I think the other part that's hard that I talk to people a lot about is like practicing the shame away, because even if you intellectually believe something different, that doesn't necessarily mean your body follows suit, right? So this doubt, like we talk a lot about, like, I left the church 5 years ago, but then my kid just had a challenge, and I'm still thinking, well, maybe if I would have stayed in the church, I wouldn't have led my kid astray. Even though intellectually you're not really there anymore, you still have that thought, because it was so indoctrinated in us that if we did anything to leave the church, that not only would we ruin our lives, but we would ruin our children's and our descendants' lives forever, right? Very strong language around the consequences of leaving.
Yeah. When you're a parent, that brings in a whole bunch more issues, right?
Yeah. And then maybe one more I would say is boundaries, because you're not really taught to say no. You're taught to sacrifice. You're taught to put yourself last. You're taught to sacrifice for your family, for your community, the amount of time and energy and money. It's all consecrated to the church. And so people have a really hard time with boundaries, and even healthy boundaries can be seen by your community as mean, right? Or like if you're saying, well, mom, I love you, and yet I really don't want you to read scriptures to my child,
Uh-huh.
which is a normal boundary, that can feel very offensive and very upsetting, right, to the mother figure in that particular setting. So it's very hard to set normal, healthy boundaries and just say, no, that's not going to work for me. I'm glad it works for you, but it's not going to work for me.
Uh-huh.
And
Yep.
people within the religion, they're not taught to have boundaries. They're taught to try to really focus on a person's salvation. So if you say, I don't want to hear these beliefs anymore, well, but I want you to be able to go to heaven with me, and that's more important than your boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So boundaries are breached a lot.
Yeah, and there's no appreciation for self-love and self-care. That seems almost like a sin.
Selfish.
Be caring. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in evangelical Christianity, it's the same thing, where taking care of yourself can seem selfish and prideful.
Right.
So
Right.
instead of
If you, although, in Mormonism, we do believe in this concept of personal agency, like we have the right to choose things, and that God sent us here to choose and make choices for ourselves. Really, the only choices that are celebrated or even seen as credible are the choices that conform with the religious,
yeah.
the religious narrative. So if you're like, well, I did pray and I did receive confirmation that this is no longer the church for me, nobody's going to believe that, because you must have gotten the wrong answer somehow. Right? And so even though we believe in personal agency, we really don't practice it at all. It's like, if you haven't gotten the right answer, that's not credible. That's not the okay path to go.
Right.
So, and there's lots of churches where they think they're the one and only way, right? So if you think you're the one and only way, which is a fairly narcissistic approach to life, then you're not really making room for diversity. You're not making room for other opportunities or other experiences that would be equally viable.
Yeah, and then there are all these church authorities, your bishops and so forth, that and even your father, the man in the organization, that supposedly know what's right for you.
Right. They have discernment, right? They have the right to discern what is best for you. And yeah, so self-authority is really, really very minimal. I remember my kid who is on the rainbow spectrum, which of course that's a whole nother thing, right? That when you talk about people sometimes lean towards truth and sometimes people lean towards emotional reasons for leaving. Well, most high demand religious communities these days are ostracizing and belittling an entire segment of our population, right? The LGBTQ plus folks. My kid, when they were a teen, a young teen, they told me about this meeting where they basically said, so, we are Mormons and that's what this means. So this is what we believe. This is what you believe. So they just feed you your entire identity. And I remember my kid raised their hand and asked about kind of LGBTQ plus things. And it's like, well, you're a Mormon, so this is what you believe. And there's no allowance for self-development or kind of having those critical thinking, skills yourself, etc. So it's very enmeshed.
Right.
Yeah. And that's hugely problematic. So yeah, I would say those are some of the things that we run into. And I think a lot of people coming from similar spaces run into similar themes. I think too, it's affected parenting approaches, where I think we're here in the United States, we're moving away from kind of maybe more authoritarian parenting, but I think Christianity had a huge effect on parenting approaches, and kids should be seen but not heard, and parents know best, and a lot of just focusing, making the child, the only way the child was going to be successful is if they followed kind of the parents' views and take care of parents' feelings. and you know, and it was almost kind of like a 7-year-old kid's job to take care of parents' feelings versus the other way around.
Yeah, I've talked about this, what looks like a blurring of responsibility in religious families, where kids are taught the fourth commandment. You know, they're supposed to honor their parents, but you'll notice there's no commandment about honoring children. The attitude towards children in the Bible is not good.
Right.
But
Right.
anyway, parents parents are expected to raise their children in the faith, like that's their primary job as a parent. So
Exactly.
this creates a problem when somebody grows up and wants to leave the faith, because then they feel terribly responsible for how their parents are going to feel about that. And parents do make a guilt trip out of it.
Mhm.
You know, look at what you're doing to me, as if it's about them.
Yep.
Right. So I have to have this conversation many times when people are dealing with these family relationships, that, you know what, your parents need to do their own adapting to the situation. And if the truth is that you're leaving the faith, then that's what they need to understand and adapt to. They're not in charge of you anymore. And their feelings are their feelings to deal with. You're not responsible for taking care of how they feel about you being who you are. It's like coming out as gay. You know, you are who you are, and it's their job to adapt to that. And that's very difficult when there's this confusion about responsibility, about who's responsible for whose feelings.
Exactly. And I mean, in our faith anyway, parents are explicitly told, if your kids leave the faith, it's pretty much because you did something wrong. So it's not only just a parent's feelings, it's a parent's sense of like, I must have failed my child, right? Like
Yeah.
I did something, I must have not prayed enough with my child, right? I must have not done family home evening enough with my child, right? I must have. So it's even more than just, oh, I'm hurt because you don't think like me. It's actually, no, I did something wrong. I
Yeah,
failed.
there's a sense of failure.
And that's really hard because now you've got really difficult emotional backlash for both sides of that party, you know, that coin. It's really sad. Well, I know we're kind of coming close to time, so I'd love to focus maybe our last few minutes on what are the tools, right? What are the practices? What are the resources? I mean, you've kind of talked a little bit, sprinkled in a little bit here and there as far as that people might find most beneficial when they're in these spaces of coming out, facing the trauma response, facing anxiety, facing the depression, facing the community backlash. What can you say briefly, like, okay, here's some things you might want to think about. Here's some things that might be helpful.
Well, one is to realize you're not alone and to get the support that you need, because, you know, this is like getting thrown out of a whole community, and you can feel very alone. So there are services available. I know that there are ex-Mormon services available, but either individual counseling or therapy, group support, retreats. We have a retreat coming up in June. But to avail yourself of people that are outside of the faith that you're leaving, who can either therapeutically be professionally helpful to you, or just be new friends in whatever capacity. It could be a photography club, it could be anything, but to find people that you can relate to, that are going to share some of your new views on life, so that you don't feel alone, and who are going to empower you to believe that you can trust yourself, that you can trust your own judgment, and begin doing all kinds of notice the decisions that you're making that are your decisions. You know, we make decisions all day, every day. You know, you get up in the morning, you choose what clothes to wear, and realize that you did that yourself. But then also, you know, other things you're going to choose, what activities to go to, what class to take, what friend to hang out with. Notice that you are able to run your own life, and gradually, and I even suggest that people keep a journal to that effect, so that you gradually build up this notion of you being an active agent. And I know that you talk about having agency in Mormonism, but that's totally contradicting the other teaching, which is that you're free to choose as long as your choices agree with ours, right? So we're talking about something different here, a real kind of personal agency that you need to develop, and to get the support with that, however way you can. I will put in a plug for Journey Free, because you can call and you can get a free consultation and talk about whether you need individual or group. We have Zoom calls 3 times a month with people from all different backgrounds, and people share how they're doing and give each other support and different challenges that they're facing, and get help from other members. There's no preaching, there's no telling you what to do, just a kind of empowerment. So we have that, and other agencies have that. And so to avail yourself of what's available.
Yes, and your website is journeyfree.org, which we will link to.
Oh.
And so, yeah, I want people to be able to check that out. The book that you've written is Leaving the Fold. You have other articles and things that you've written as well. And you also have a resource for professionals. Is that correct? People who are working with people who are leaving religion?
Yes, we have professional development. And this is exciting because there is very, very little training right now for people that are specializing in working with people recovering from religion. So we're trying to address that. And so we have this group, this professional support group, that has resources on the website. It also has, we have Zoom calls every month in which we talk about special topics that are related to working with this population. And like, for example, next month, we're going to talk about working with people that are formerly ultra-Orthodox Jewish, and particular populations like that, but also how to deal with the fear of hell, or how to deal with grief, or the various things that that we need to learn about with regard to this particular population. We meet and talk about that every month. So again, you can go to journeyfree.org, and in the services area, there's one that says professional development, and you can find out more about that. There's no obligation, just have a chat with me and see if it's something that you want to deal with, want to have in your life.
Yeah, no, I love it. Thank you so much for your time today. I don't know if there's any last things that maybe you were hoping to cover that I didn't ask you about, or any last thoughts that you'd like to leave us with.
No, I'd like to just support you and tell you thank you for your interest in this area. I think that everybody in the psychology world pulling together right now and offering what they can in this area of religious trauma, and also making it more known to the public, to the culture, that religious trauma is a real thing.
Yes.
And that there's no shame in coming out to say that you don't believe anymore, and that there are resources to help you with that. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. And I hope you understand this legacy that you have created. I mean, it's been very, very profound. I think your work is very profound. So thank you so much for all the resources and work that you've put together in this particular field. So nice to meet you, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Okay. All right. You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. outside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nå dich geschehen alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nå dich geschehen alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.